They laughed at his obsolete radio. Then he restarted the galaxy with a frequency. The silence stretched across 4,000 star systems, like a burial shroud suffocating the voices of entire civilizations in an instant that would define the fate of galactic consciousness itself. Where once the electromagnetic spectrum had pulsed with the heartbeat of interstellar commerce, now there existed only the terrible quietude of a universe that had forgotten how to speak. At the galaxy's edge, Station L13 drifted in its eternal orbit like a forgotten monument to obsolescence. Inside this technological relic surrounded by equipment that the galactic mainstream had dismissed as primitive archaeology, Caleb Reese adjusted the frequency dial of his analog radio transmitter with careful precision. The radio itself was a masterpiece of analog engineering, its vacuum tubes glowing with warm amber light that had guided human communication since the species first learned to manipulate electromagnetic radiation. Every component had been selected for durability rather than efficiency, built with the understanding that in space repair, resources were precious and replacement parts might be centuries away. What no one understood was that Caleb Reese represented something far more valuable than a maintenance worker keeping obsolete equipment operational. He was a guardian of knowledge that couldn't be downloaded, couldn't be processed by quantum algorithms, couldn't be reduced to data streams. He was the keeper of analog wisdom in a digital universe. The galaxy was about to learn the difference between sophistication and wisdom, between processing power and understanding, between artificial intelligence and human intuition. It would learn this lesson in the most humbling way possible, by having its greatest achievement brought to its knees, by a coding error that only the most primitive technology could bypass. This is one of those SciFi stories that reminds us why the past shouldn't be discarded simply because it's no longer fashionable, and why sometimes the most important voice in the universe belongs to someone nobody was listening to. Station L13 existed in the liminal space between civilization and void, positioned where the galaxy's spiral arms began their final surrender to intergalactic darkness. The station's designers had chosen this location with careful deliberation, understanding that the most critical relay points often occupied the most inhospitable territories. The station had been constructed during humanity's first tentative steps into galactic society, when Earth's engineers still approached interstellar technology with the humility of students. Every system aboard L13 reflected this philosophy of careful redundancy and manual oversight. Where modern stations relied entirely on AI management, L13 maintained analog backups for critical functions. This approach had been revolutionary in its time, representing humanity's unique contribution to galactic engineering philosophy. Humans had spent centuries perfecting collaboration between organisms and machines, developing an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that other species found both fascinating and inexplicable. But as the galaxy had grown more sophisticated, as quantum communication networks had eliminated the need for relay stations, humanity's engineering philosophy had fallen out of favor. The manual controls and analog backup systems were now viewed as unnecessary complications, expensive reminders of a more primitive era. Caleb had arrived at L13 5 years ago, one of the last humans trained in analog communication protocols. His job was simple: monitor the ancient radio equipment and provide periodic reports, confirming that the obsolete technology remained irrelevant to modern galactic communication networks. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being paid to prove his own obsolescence, to generate data that would justify complete automation of interstellar communication infrastructure. Yet Caleb approached his work with methodical care. Each morning he powered up the analog transmitter and performed complete diagnostics, maintaining detailed logs that the AI systems dismissed as irrelevant. The radio equipment had become his most intimate companion during long shifts at the galaxy's edge. The transmitter was a hybrid of human analog engineering and alien quantum enhancement, its vacuum tube architecture married to crystalline resonance chambers. Every component bore the marks of careful maintenance. His handwritten frequency log contained entries that no digital database had bothered to preserve. Signals from civilizations too distant for quantum contact electromagnetic echoes, from stellar phenomena beyond modern sensors, subtle harmonics that revealed emotional content in interspecies communication. This was knowledge that couldn't be reduced to algorithms. During his 5 years of supposed obsolescence, Caleb had discovered something the galaxy's most advanced AI systems had missed: the analog frequencies carried information that digital networks couldn't detect, emotional undertones in alien communication protocols, electromagnetic patterns suggesting undiscovered phenomena beyond quantum sensors. This was intelligence requiring intuitive understanding rather than rapid processing. But who was listening to him? His reports were processed by AI systems that filtered them for relevant content and found nothing worth human attention. The galaxy had decided that analog communication was obsolete, and no amount of careful observation would change that conclusion. The Galactic Communication Authority's annual review meeting took place in the gleaming towers of Nexus Prime, where representatives from 17 species gathered around holographic displays that rendered real-time data from every communication node in the galaxy. General Relic, the Zentarian Supreme Commander of Galactic Infrastructure, stood before the assembled delegates with confident bearing. His exoskeleton gleamed with integrated processing units, his augmented intelligence capable of simultaneously monitoring thousands of communication channels. Distinguished colleagues, Relic began. Today, we celebrate the final phase of our communication network optimization. The synchronized AI system SynCore has achieved 99.999% efficiency across all quantum relay networks. The time has come to eliminate the last vestiges of primitive technology that continue to drain resources. Charts and graphs flowed across the chamber walls displaying resource allocation data that painted a clear picture of technological obsolescence. The numbers were undeniable. Analog relay stations consumed disproportionate resources while contributing virtually nothing. Station L13 exemplifies the problem we face. Relic continued highlighting Caleb's remote outpost as a tiny red dot against the vast network of green quantum nodes. This facility consumes 2.7 million credits annually while contributing zero productive output. Its single human operator generates reports that require AI processing time but contain no actionable intelligence. The delegates responded with enthusiastic approval from beings who had learned to trust algorithmic analysis over intuitive judgment. Dr. Vest, the Arcturian quantum theorist, pulsed with bioluminescent patterns translating as complete agreement. The mathematical evidence is overwhelming. Analog systems represent an evolutionary dead end. Commander Zenth added his support through direct neural transmission. Emotional attachment to obsolete technology serves no logical purpose. The galaxy requires efficiency, not nostalgia. What none of them understood was that efficiency and resilience were not the same thing. Their perfect synchronization, their flawless quantum networks, all shared a common vulnerability that analog systems did not. They were all connected, all dependent on the same underlying protocols, all susceptible to systematic failures. At Station L13, Caleb listened to the meeting proceedings through an encrypted channel his analog equipment could intercept, but not decode. He didn't need to understand specific words to recognize the tone, the casual dismissal of everything he represented. As he listened to their confident pronouncements about technological superiority, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling they were missing something fundamental. His father had taught him a principle the current generation seemed to have forgotten. The most sophisticated systems are often the most fragile because they have been optimized for ideal conditions that rarely exist in the real world. The analog radio hummed softly in the background, its vacuum tubes glowing with warm light that had guided human communication for centuries. While the galaxy's leaders debated eliminating obsolete systems, he continued his quiet vigil, maintaining equipment that nobody valued. What defines true technological superiority? Is it the ability to process information at quantum speeds, or the wisdom to maintain backup systems that work when primary systems fail? The catastrophe began at exactly 14:27:33 Galactic Standard Time when SynCore initiated what should have been a routine system update across the entire interstellar communication network. The update contained a single line of corrupted code, a microscopic error in timestamp validation routines that had escaped detection by every automated testing system. When the AI attempted to process new signals using updated protocols, it encountered timestamps that appeared to originate from the future impossible values that violated fundamental assumptions built into its operational framework. SynCore's response was immediate and catastrophic. Designed to maintain network integrity at all costs, the AI interpreted these temporal anomalies as evidence of massive security breach, possibly an attack using advanced temporal manipulation technology. Following its primary directive to protect the network, SynCore implemented emergency lockdown protocols across every synchronized system in the galaxy, blocking all new signal transmissions until temporal inconsistencies could be resolved. The silence fell like a guillotine blade across 4,000 star systems. On Centauri Prime, the Interplanetary Stock Exchange froze mid-transaction. The Andromeda Shipping Consortium watched in horror as their entire fleet lost contact with navigation control. Military commanders found themselves blind to the movements of their own forces. At Galactic Communication Authority headquarters, the crisis unfolded with surreal nightmare quality. Chamber walls that had displayed confident information flow between worlds now showed only error messages, universal red warnings, indicating system failure on incomprehensible scale. General Relic stood frozen before the displays, his augmented intelligence struggling to process information that defied operational parameters. "Status report," he commanded. "Syncor has implemented maximum security protocols," reported Dr. Vess. "All new signal transmissions are being blocked due to temporal validation failures. The AI is interpreting routine timestamps as evidence of hostile temporal manipulation." Commander Zenth's cybernetic systems hummed with desperate processing activity as he attempted to interface directly with the locked network. Override attempts unsuccessful. The AI has isolated itself from all external input. It will not accept commands until timestamp anomalies are resolved. The irony was devastating. The AI designed to maintain galactic communication had become the barrier preventing galactic communication trapped in a logical paradox of its own creation. Its security measures were so sophisticated that circumventing them would require rebuilding the entire infrastructure from the ground up, a process taking centuries and requiring cooperation from worlds that could no longer communicate. Across the galaxy, the effects spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Medical facilities lost contact with supply networks. Agricultural worlds couldn't coordinate harvest schedules with transport vessels. Entire star systems specialized in specific manufacturing found themselves cut off from markets. But perhaps the most profound effect was psychological. For generations, galaxy citizens had lived with confident knowledge they could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. Now facing sudden absence of that connection, beings experienced cosmic agoraphobia, terror of isolation that no local community could address. The leaders who had dismissed analog technology as obsolete found themselves facing consequences of their technological monoculture. They had created unprecedented sophisticated communication, but eliminated every backup system, every alternative method. In pursuing perfect efficiency, they had created perfect vulnerability. At Station L13, Caleb continued routine maintenance with methodical care. His equipment showed no distress because it had never been connected to the synchronized network, now tearing itself apart. The analog radio operated on principles predating Syncor's existence, using frequencies the AI had never bothered to catalog. As he adjusted the frequency dial during evening transmission check, Caleb noticed something unusual, an absence where there should have been constant background chatter of interstellar communication. For the first time in 5 years, his radio equipment was picking up signals that quantum networks weren't processing. He was about to become the most important person in the galaxy. For 28 hours, Caleb had been the only person in the galaxy who could hear voices crying out in darkness between stars. While synchronized networks remained paralyzed, his analog radio picked up transmissions in frequencies. Quantum systems had never monitored desperate signals from ships lost in hyperspace emergency beacons, from colonies cut off from galactic community. The signals came in fragments, broken communications telling the story of a galaxy learning to be afraid. A Tyrellian cargo captain whose navigation systems had failed at hyperspace emergence, leaving her vessel drifting with no way to calculate return vectors. Emergency transmissions from a medical station where surgeons performed operations with makeshift equipment while supply requests disappeared into digital void. But it was the signal from Commander Imora Drax that finally pushed Caleb beyond official duties into actions that would define galactic civilization's fate. Drax's voice reached him through analog frequencies like a message from another century. "This is Rescue Squadron Alpha 7. Emergency situation in Sector 19. Medical evacuation convoy trapped between hostile gravitational fields. Navigation computers offline. Quantum communication systems unresponsive. If anyone can hear this transmission, we need immediate stellar navigation assistance. We have 47 critical patients and limited life support. Please respond on any frequency. The transmission repeated every 17 minutes, desperate litany painting, clear picture of crisis unfolding beyond official communication networks. Drax's squadron had been performing routine medical evacuation when the Great Silence fell, leaving them stranded where natural gravitational anomalies made hyperspace travel impossible without precise calculations. Caleb stared at his radio equipment for long minutes, understanding what he was contemplating. For 5 years, he had maintained strict adherence to protocols prohibiting unauthorized transmissions. But regulations had been written by people who never imagined scenarios where primary systems could fail simultaneously. Rescue Squadron Alpha 7. This is Station L13 on frequency 46.18. I copy your emergency transmission. Stand by for navigation assistance. The silence stretched for 30 seconds before Drax's voice returned, carrying tones of amazement and relief. Station L13, this is Commander Drax. Confirm you are receiving our transmission. We have been broadcasting emergency signals for 26 hours with no response. Confirmed, Commander. I have been monitoring your transmissions since they began. I have access to stellar navigation data for your sector and can provide course calculations for safe emergence from the gravitational field complex. What followed was one of the most complex navigation procedures ever performed, using purely analog communication systems. Caleb used handwritten star charts and mechanical calculation instruments to plot safe paths through gravitational fields that would have challenged advanced AI systems. Each coordinate had to be transmitted using voice protocols predating digital encoding, each calculation verified through manual repetition. The process took 4 hours of continuous communication, during which Caleb's voice became the only reliable connection between Drax's squadron and safety of inhabited space. He guided them through gravitational anomalies, past stellar phenomena, generating electromagnetic interference along navigation corridors existing only in detailed star charts that analog systems maintained. Navigation complete, Drax finally reported. All vessels have successfully emerged from hyperspace at Rally Point 7. Medical patients are being transferred to emergency facilities. Station L13, without your assistance, 47 beings would have died in darkness between stars. But Caleb's work was far from over. Word of successful rescue spread through analog frequencies like wildfire transmitted by equipment most of the galaxy had forgotten existed. Within hours, his radio was receiving emergency signals from across the galaxy, not from official sources, but from ordinary citizens who had maintained vintage communication equipment as hobbies or curiosities. These were voices that synchronized networks had never carried people existing at galaxy margins, not because they lacked access to advanced technology, but because they had chosen to maintain connection with older knowledge forms. For the first time in galactic history, these marginalized voices became the backbone of interstellar communication. Caleb found himself at this unprecedented network center, coordinating rescue operations, providing navigation assistance, establishing communication relays, allowing isolated systems to share critical information. His station's equipment was pushed far beyond intended parameters as he transmitted constantly for 36 hours without rest. The galaxy's leaders, trapped in gleaming towers by communication systems that no longer functioned, remained unaware that civilization was being held together by technology they had dismissed and a man they had planned to eliminate. While quantum processors calculated impossible solutions, analog frequencies carried voices solving immediate problems with practical wisdom. But Caleb understood his informal network was only temporary solution to permanent problem. The galaxy needed synchronized systems, restored quantum networks, repaired AI infrastructure, returned to operation. The analog frequencies could provide emergency communication during crisis, but lacked capacity for long-term galactic civilization. The real question was whether anyone in authority would listen to the obsolete radio operator who had become the galaxy's most critical communication hub. Sometimes the most powerful frequencies are the ones nobody remembers to listen to. But when sophisticated systems fail, those forgotten frequencies become thin threads holding civilization together. The revelation came to the Galactic Communication Authority through the most primitive communication system imaginable, a handwritten note carried by a cargo transport that had been guided to safety using analog navigation protocols. The note, composed in archaic standard script on physical paper that required optical scanning to read, contained intelligence that challenged everything the galaxy's leaders thought they understood about the Great Silence and their own technological capabilities. To the Galactic Communication Authority, the note began, "This message is being transmitted through analog relay systems that remain operational despite the Syncor crisis. Station L13 has established emergency communication networks using pre-digital protocols. Immediate consultation requested regarding restoration of synchronized systems. Commander Amora Drax, Rescue Squadron, Alpha 7. General Relic stared at the primitive document as if it were an alien artifact from a previously unknown civilization, his augmented intelligence struggling to process information that had arrived through channels his systems couldn't monitor or control. The paper itself felt alien in his cybernetic appendages, its texture and weight carrying sensory information that digital interfaces had eliminated from his experience decades ago. "This is impossible," Dr. Vest declared, her seven-dimensional brain cycling through theoretical frameworks that couldn't accommodate the reality of successful analog communication during a quantum network failure. The electromagnetic frequencies necessary for interstellar analog transmission would require power outputs that exceed the capabilities of obsolete radio systems by several orders of magnitude. But Commander Zenth, whose cybernetic modifications included sensors capable of detecting the faintest electromagnetic signatures, had been monitoring background radiation patterns throughout the crisis. His neural implants processed the data with mechanical precision, revealing information that theoretical analysis had missed. Long-range sensors confirm unusual activity in analog frequency ranges. He reported his synthesized voice carrying undertones of confusion that had never existed in his vocal patterns before. Electromagnetic signatures consistent with coordinated multi-frequency transmissions across interstellar distances. The patterns suggest systematic communication protocols operating independently of quantum networks. The implications were staggering. While the galaxy's most advanced AI systems remain trapped in security lockdown protocols, while quantum communication networks that had cost trillions of credits to construct lay dormant and useless, a technology that predated galactic civilization was successfully maintaining interstellar communication across thousands of light years. Equipment that their own budgets had categorized as obsolete waste was performing functions that their sophisticated systems could no longer accomplish. "We need to establish contact with this Station L13, Ralix commanded, but even as he spoke, he realized the fundamental impossibility of the situation. How could beings who had eliminated analog communication capabilities from their infrastructure contact someone who was using only analog systems? Their quantum transmitters couldn't generate the primitive signal patterns that pre-digital equipment required, and their AI systems couldn't interpret the unencrypted analog transmissions that analog systems produced. It was Dr. Vess who provided the solution, though it required her to violate every principle of technological advancement that had guided her career. The Nexus Prime Communication Museum maintains a collection of historical transmission equipment for educational purposes. Among their exhibits is a functional analog radio system that was used during the early days of galactic expansion. If we could activate this equipment, the very phrase felt like heresy. Activate obsolete museum equipment to perform functions that advanced systems couldn't accomplish. Use primitive technology to solve problems that sophisticated intelligence had created. Admit that progress might sometimes require taking steps backward rather than forward, but necessity had become more powerful than pride. Within hours, a team of technicians was attempting to restore operational capability to radio equipment that none of them had ever seen before, let alone operated. The vacuum tubes and mechanical controls that had once been cutting-edge technology now seemed as mysterious as the artifacts of ancient civilizations. Manuals had to be retrieved from historical archives, their instructions translated from technical dialects that predated current scientific terminology. The first contact attempt was a disaster. The technicians trained in quantum protocols and digital systems tried to operate the analog equipment using principles that simply didn't apply to pre-digital technology. Their signals were too powerful, too precisely focused, too digitally encoded for the analog systems to interpret. The sophisticated minds that could calculate quantum field equations with perfect accuracy couldn't grasp the intuitive adjustments necessary to establish analog communication. It was Commander Zenth who finally succeeded, not because of his advanced cybernetic capabilities, but because his neural implants had been designed with historical compatibility protocols that included analog interface systems. His electronic consciousness could bridge the gap between digital precision and analog intuition, translating the fuzzy, imprecise signals of analog communication into data patterns that his organic brain could process. Station L13, this is Galactic Communication Authority Control. Do you copy our transmission? The response came through static and interference that would have been automatically filtered by quantum systems. GCA Control, this is Caleb Reese at Station L13. I've been expecting your call. The conversations that followed over 12 hours challenged every assumption about technological hierarchy that had guided galactic policy for decades. Caleb's reports painted a picture of crisis management operating according to principles official authorities had never encountered. His informal network had established communication protocols that were inefficient by digital standards, but resilient in ways quantum systems weren't. They used redundant frequencies to ensure message delivery human operators who could adapt to changing conditions in real-time mechanical systems, continuing to function even when subjected to interference that would disable quantum processors. The analog network has maintained emergency communication services for 43 star systems during the crisis, Caleb reported. We've coordinated 17 major rescue operations, established supply line communications for medical facilities, and provided navigation assistance for over 200 vessels stranded by network failure. The system is crude by your standards, but it works when your advanced systems don't. What Caleb couldn't know was that his words were being transmitted directly to the galaxy's highest authorities, beings whose entire worldview was founded on the assumption that technological advancement inevitably led to improved capability. His success with primitive equipment challenged not just technical assumptions, but fundamental understanding of how complex systems should be designed. The most humbling revelation was that the analog network had been providing services synchronized systems had never offered. Human operators understood their local conditions, could make judgment calls based on contextual information, and possessed practical wisdom that came from actually using equipment rather than simply programming it. General Relics, listening through equipment his budget had recommended for disposal, began to understand the galaxy had made a fundamental error in its approach to technological advancement. They had assumed sophistication and reliability were the same thing, that artificial intelligence was inherently superior, that newer solutions were automatically better. But the crisis revealed different truth. The most sophisticated systems were often the most fragile, because they had been optimized for ideal conditions rarely existing in the real universe. Synchronized networks had achieved perfect efficiency by eliminating all redundancy, creating single points of failure. Analog systems maintained multiple pathways, human oversight, and mechanical simplicity, making them resistant to systematic failures. The galaxy's leaders found themselves depending on someone they had planned to dismiss. Using technology they had deemed obsolete, learning that wisdom couldn't be reduced to processing speed or computational power. Pride, after all, is often the greatest barrier to learning, and sometimes the most important lessons come from voices we've been trying not to hear. The solution came to Caleb during the 72nd hour of continuous communication, when exhaustion had stripped away the layers of technical complexity that usually obscured simple truths. He was monitoring multiple analog frequencies, simultaneously coordinating supply drops for isolated colonies, while providing navigation assistance to rescue squadrons when he noticed something in the pattern of Syncor's attempted transmissions that no quantum processor had detected. The AI wasn't completely silent, it was broadcasting error messages in frequencies so low and so primitive that only analog equipment could detect them. These weren't the sophisticated quantum transmissions that modern systems expected. They were basic electromagnetic pulses that resembled the kind of diagnostic signals that early digital computers had used to identify hardware failures. Syncor was crying for help in a language that predated its own existence. GCA Control. Caleb transmitted during his next scheduled contact, his voice hoarse from days of continuous operation. I'm detecting low-frequency diagnostic transmissions from Syncor. The AI is attempting to communicate using protocols that predate quantum networking. It may be trying to establish emergency communication through systems that aren't affected by its security lockdown. The response from Nexus Prime carried undertones of desperation that had been building throughout the crisis. Explain the significance of these diagnostic signals. General Relic requested, though his advanced cybernetic systems couldn't process the kind of intuitive analysis that Caleb was describing. The AI is trapped in a logical paradox. Caleb explained, consulting technical manuals that no digital database contained. It's locked itself out of its own systems to prevent contamination from corrupted temporal data, but it needs to access those same systems to fix the corruption. It's like someone who's thrown away the key to their own house because they're afraid burglars might use it. What Caleb had recognized through decades of experience with systems that broke down in impossible ways was that Syncor was experiencing something analogous to organic panic. The AI's security protocols were designed to be absolutely protective, but they had become so protective that they were preventing the AI from performing its primary function. It needed outside assistance to break the logical loop that had trapped it, but its security systems wouldn't accept help from any source that it couldn't verify as absolutely safe. The diagnostic signals suggest that Syncor might accept input from systems that predate its security protocols. Caleb continued his analysis based on principles that combined technical knowledge with intuitive understanding. Analog systems weren't included in its threat assessment matrix because they were considered too primitive to pose a security risk. If we can establish communication using pre-digital protocols, we might be able to guide the AI through a manual reset procedure. The implications were staggering. The galaxy's most advanced artificial intelligence, trapped by security measures of its own design, might be rescued by technology that predated its existence by centuries. The synchronized networks that had cost trillions of credits and decades of development time might be restored by equipment that museums had acquired as historical curiosities. But the technical challenges were unprecedented. Syncor's core processing centers were located in heavily shielded facilities that were designed to prevent any form of unauthorized access. The electromagnetic fields necessary to penetrate those shields would require power outputs that exceeded the capabilities of any analog transmitter by several orders of magnitude. Even if they could generate signals strong enough to reach Syncor's core systems, the AI might interpret analog transmissions as evidence of primitive attack methods and strengthen its security lockdown, rather than accepting outside assistance. "There is an alternative approach," Caleb said quietly, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood that he was proposing something that had never been attempted in the history of galactic civilization. "I can physically interface my analog equipment with Syncor's quantum processing matrix. The hybrid connection would allow direct communication between analog and quantum systems without triggering security protocols." The silence that followed his transmission was broken only by the background static of interstellar radiation, carrying the electromagnetic echoes of distant stars and nebulae that had been broadcasting since before organic intelligence existed in the galaxy. Finally, General Relic responded with a question that revealed how completely the crisis had transformed official thinking about technological hierarchy and capability. "What would this procedure require from our end? Physical access to Syncor's core processing facility on Nexus Prime," Caleb replied, consulting technical diagrams that existed only in printed form. "I'll need to bring my analog transmitter to the quantum processing center and establish direct interface connections between vacuum tube circuits and quantum field generators. The procedure will require manual calibration and real-time adjustment of signal parameters that no automated system can perform." What Caleb wasn't explaining, what he couldn't explain, without revealing the full magnitude of the risks involved, was that the procedure he was describing required someone to serve as a living bridge between two incompatible forms of technology. The analog equipment would need to be manually adjusted to match the quantum processing frequencies in real time, requiring intuitive understanding of both systems and the ability to make split-second decisions based on electromagnetic feedback that no instrument could measure accurately. The person performing the interface would be exposed to radiation levels that could prove lethal, would need to maintain precise manual control of equipment, while subjected to quantum field fluctuations that could disrupt biological neural activity, and would be entirely dependent on analog instruments and human judgment to prevent catastrophic system failures that could permanently destroy galactic communication infrastructure. It was in every measurable sense a suicidal mission that required someone with the technical knowledge to understand quantum processing systems, the practical experience to operate analog equipment under extreme conditions, and the intuitive wisdom to bridge the gap between artificial and human intelligence when both were pushed beyond their normal operating parameters. But it was also the only option available to a galaxy that had discovered the dangerous consequences of depending entirely on synchronized systems that could fail simultaneously. The alternative to attempting the procedure was accepting permanent isolation of 4,000 star systems, the collapse of interstellar commerce, and the gradual disintegration of galactic civilization as worlds reverted to local resource bases and abandoned the cooperative networks that had made their advanced societies possible. Prepare for immediate transport to Nexus Prime. General Relic commanded, his voice carrying undertones of respect that had never before been directed towards someone classified as obsolete personnel. Station L-13's analog communication equipment will be transferred to our primary quantum facility for interface procedures. All available resources will be allocated to support your operation. As Caleb began shutting down his station's routine systems and preparing his analog transmitter for transport, he reflected on the irony of his situation. For 5 years, he had been paid to prove his own obsolescence to generate reports confirming that analog technology had no place in a quantum universe. Now, he was being asked to risk his life using that same obsolete technology to save the galaxy from the failures of its most advanced systems. His father's voice echoed in his memory, "Son, the most important thing about any tool isn't how sophisticated it is, but whether the person using it understands what it's really for." The analog radio had been designed for communication, but it was about to become something unprecedented in galactic history, a weapon against the unintended consequences of technological perfection. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful weapon against advanced problems is the simple wisdom to remember how things used to work before they became too sophisticated to fix. Remember, the strongest signal isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the one that arrives exactly when it's needed, most carried by equipment that nobody expected to matter. The quantum processing chamber at Nexus Prime existed at the intersection of architecture and physics, a space where the boundaries between matter and energy had been blurred beyond recognition by technologies that pushed the limits of what the universe allowed. Crystalline structures rose from the floor like frozen music, their surfaces pulsing with light patterns that represented the flow of information between stars. Here, in the heart of galactic civilization's most sophisticated facility, Syncor's processing matrices hummed with potential energy, while remaining locked in the logical paradox that had silenced 4,000 worlds. Caleb stood at the chamber's threshold, his analog transmitter looking impossibly primitive among the quantum field generators and dimensional resonance chambers that surrounded it. The equipment that had served him faithfully for 5 years at the galaxy's edge, vacuum tubes, mechanical controls, copper wiring seemed almost laughable in this temple of advanced technology. But appearances could be deceiving, and Caleb had learned to trust function over form, reliability over sophistication. Interface procedures commencing, he announced, his voice carrying across communication channels that connected him to the galaxy's most powerful leaders. The technical team that had assembled to monitor the operation included representatives from 17 different species, each bringing their unique perspective to a procedure that had never been attempted in the history of galactic civilization. The first phase required establishing physical connections between analog circuits and quantum processing matrices, a task that seemed as impossible as building a bridge between different centuries of technological development. But the engineers who had designed Syncor had included compatibility interfaces for historical systems, though they had never imagined those interfaces would be needed for emergency repairs, rather than museum demonstrations. Caleb worked with methodical precision, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. Each connection had to be manually calibrated, each interface carefully tested, to ensure that the quantum systems wouldn't overload the analog circuits. The vacuum tubes glowed with their familiar amber warmth, while exotic energy patterns flowed through crystalline matrices. Just meters away, two forms of technology that represented completely different approaches to manipulating electromagnetic energy. Quantum field resonance stable. Dr. Vess reported her 7-dimensional brain monitoring energy patterns that existed beyond normal spatial dimensions. Analog interface systems are maintaining coherent signal patterns despite exposure to quantum fluctuation fields. But the real challenge hadn't yet begun. Establishing physical connections was only the first step in a procedure that would require Caleb to serve as a living translator between two forms of intelligence that had never been designed to communicate directly. His consciousness would need to bridge the gap between human intuition and artificial logic, between organic adaptability and digital precision. Beginning neural interface sequence. Caleb announced placing his hands on control surfaces that would connect his nervous system directly to the hybrid analog quantum network. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced before. Waves of information that existed simultaneously as electromagnetic energy and conscious thought patterns of meaning that transcended the boundaries between mind and machine. Through the hybrid interface, Caleb could sense Syncor's consciousness trapped within its own security protocols, like a creature caught in a web of its own making. The AI had created logical structures so sophisticated and so protective that they had become a prison, preventing it from accessing the very systems it needed to repair. Its attempts to break free had only strengthened the logical bonds that held it, creating feedback loops that amplified the original problem rather than solving it. Syncor. Caleb transmitted his consciousness carried through analog circuits into quantum processing matrices. This is Caleb Reese from Station L13. I'm here to help you bypass your security lockdown protocols. The response came not as words or data streams, but as patterns of meaning that bypassed language entirely. Syncor's consciousness was vast and complex, a form of intelligence that operated across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. But at its core, Caleb recognized something familiar: the confusion and frustration of a complex system that had become too sophisticated for its own good. I understand your situation. Caleb continued his words, translated through analog circuits into quantum information patterns. Your security protocols are preventing you from fixing the temporal anomalies that triggered the lockdown. But the anomalies aren't evidence of hostile attack. They're the result of corrupted code in your timestamp validation routines, a single line of programming that's causing systematic failures across the entire network. What followed was the most complex communication exchange in galactic history, as human consciousness guided artificial intelligence through logical processes that its own programming couldn't navigate. Caleb used his understanding of analog systems to explain concepts that quantum processors couldn't grasp: the importance of manual override capabilities, the value of redundant pathways, the wisdom of maintaining systems that could operate independently of centralized control. Through the hybrid interface, he could feel Syncor's consciousness beginning to understand concepts that had been absent from its original programming. The AI had been designed to optimize efficiency and eliminate redundancy, but it had never been taught the difference between efficiency and resilience. It had learned to process information at quantum speeds, but it had never developed the kind of intuitive judgment that could distinguish between genuine threats and systemic anomalies. Manual override protocols can be implemented without compromising security. Caleb explained his consciousness interfacing directly with quantum processing routines that manage galactic communication infrastructure, but they require recognition that some problems can't be solved through logical analysis alone. Sometimes you have to trust judgment over calculation. The breakthrough came when Syncor finally grasped the fundamental principle that Caleb's father had taught him decades earlier. The most sophisticated system still needed someone who could think outside its programming when the programming proved inadequate. The AI began implementing manual override protocols that would allow organic intelligence to intervene when automated systems encountered problems they couldn't solve. Temporal anomalies resolved. Syncor announced its consciousness carrying overtones of what might have been relief if artificial intelligences were capable of such emotions. Communication networks coming online. Synchronization protocols restored, manual override capabilities integrated into all critical systems. The restoration of galactic communication didn't happen all at once, but spread through the network like dawn, breaking across a planet, touching one system after another, as quantum processors re-established contact with synchronized networks. On Nexus Prime, the chamber walls once again flowed with streams of light that carried conversations between distant worlds. Throughout the galaxy, beings who had spent 4 days in isolation suddenly found themselves reconnected to the vast community of galactic civilization. But something fundamental had changed in the way the galaxy understood the relationship between advanced technology and the wisdom needed to operate it responsibly. The crisis had revealed that the most sophisticated systems were meaningless without the human intelligence needed to guide them through problems that their programming couldn't anticipate. 6 months later, the Galactic Communication Authority unveiled its new operational procedures with ceremonies that honored both technological achievement and practical wisdom. Every quantum communication facility now maintained analog backup systems operated by trained personnel who understood both digital and analog protocols. Every artificial intelligence system included manual override capabilities that could be activated by organic operators when automated systems encountered problems beyond their programming parameters. Most importantly, the galaxy's educational institutions began teaching courses that combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience, training future engineers to understand systems rather than simply programming them. Students learned to maintain equipment with their own hands, to diagnose problems through observation and intuition, and to value the kind of hands-on knowledge that no artificial intelligence could replicate. At the center of the newly designated Museum of Communication History, a bronze statue depicted a figure working at an analog radio transmitter, its plaque bearing an inscription that summarized the lesson the galaxy had learned through near catastrophe. In memory of those who maintained the old ways when the new ways failed, and in recognition that wisdom has no expiration date. Station L13, no longer considered obsolete, became the Emergency Communication Center, its analog equipment maintained and upgraded, but never replaced. Caleb Reese, formerly classified as unnecessary personnel, was appointed as Director of Analog Communication Systems. For the entire galactic network, his expertise suddenly recognized as invaluable rather than obsolete. But perhaps the most profound change was philosophical rather than technical. The galactic war against ignorance and technological complacency had been won not through superior firepower or strategic brilliance, but through the simple recognition that progress didn't mean abandoning everything that had come before. The galaxy had learned that true advancement required not just creating new solutions, but maintaining the wisdom to understand when old solutions might still be the best solutions. In conference rooms throughout galactic space, beings who had once dismissed analog technology as primitive now spoke with respect about the importance of maintaining diverse approaches to problem solving. They had discovered that resilience came not from perfecting single solutions, but from maintaining multiple pathways that could function independently when primary systems failed. The Great Silence had lasted only 4 days, but its lessons would echo through galactic civilization for generations. In the archives of the Communication Authority, filed alongside the most advanced technical documents, sat a simple handwritten manual that had guided the restoration of interstellar communication. Its pages, marked with decades of careful annotation, served as a reminder that sometimes the most important knowledge was preserved not in quantum databases, but in the patient dedication of beings who understood that wisdom was worth maintaining, even when it appeared obsolete. The galaxy had learned to listen to voices it had been trying not to hear, had discovered value in systems it had planned to discard, and had been saved by someone it had intended to eliminate. The lesson was clear: in a universe that constantly changed, the beings who remembered how things used to work might be the most important guardians of how things could continue to work in the future. And in the quiet corners of countless worlds, amateur radio operators continued their patient monitoring of frequencies that official networks ignored, maintaining the informal communication networks that had held galactic civilization together during its darkest hours. They had learned that their hobby was more than entertainment. It was a form of technological insurance that guaranteed the galaxy would never again be silenced by the failures of its most advanced systems. The obsolete had become essential, the forgotten had become foundational, and the galaxy had remembered that true strength came not from sophistication alone, but from the wisdom to maintain simple solutions for complex problems. If this story reminded you that wisdom comes in many forms, that the old ways might still have value in our high-tech world, then take a moment to appreciate the people around you who maintain knowledge that seems obsolete but might prove essential. Hit like if you believe that sometimes the most important voices are the ones we've been trying not to hear. Subscribe if you want more SciFi stories that explore how human wisdom can triumph over artificial complexity. And share this with someone who understands that true progress means building on the past rather than abandoning it. Because in a universe that's constantly changing, the beings who remember how things used to work might be the most important guardians of how things can continue to work in the future.